The dust of the Arizona Territory doesn't just settle on your land. It settles in your soul. For Martha Sullivan, a widow living a stone's throw from the Dragoon Mountains, that dust was mixed with memory and solitude. Her world was the creak of her porch swing, the scent of dried sage, and the vast, silent judgment of the sky. But on a blistering Tuesday afternoon, in the autumn of '83, a different sound rode in on the wind. It wasn't the cry of a hawk or the rattle of a snake. It was the crack of gunfire, sharp and desperate, followed by the splintering thunder of a man's scream. That was the moment Martha's quiet life ended, and the story I'm about to tell you began a story of blood bargains and the kind of trouble that comes knocking when you least expect it with rifles in hand. Martha Sullivan was on her knees, tending to the stubborn patch of earth she called a garden, when the first shot echoed off the granite shoulders of the mountains. It was a sound she hadn't heard since her husband Frank had taken his rifle out to put down a rabid coyote 2 years prior. This was different. This wasn't a single deliberate shot. It was a panicked volley, followed by the frantic, high-pitched retort of a different caliber rifle. She pushed a stray strand of auburn hair from her brow, her blue eyes accustomed to scanning the horizon for rain clouds now narrowing towards the source of the commotion. A plume of ochre dust was rising, a half-mile east, a sure sign of hard-riding horses. Her first instinct, the one Frank had drilled into her, was to go inside, bar the door, and fetch the Winchester he'd left her. It leaned against the wall by the hearth, a silent, steely companion. But then came the scream. It wasn't a cry of rage. It was a shriek of pure agony that sliced through the afternoon heat. It was a sound so human, so stripped of pretense, that it bypassed her instinct for self-preservation and struck something deeper, something maternal and achingly lonely. Before she knew what she was doing, Martha was on her feet, her gardening trowel falling silently into the turned soil. She ran to the edge of her property, where the scrubby grass gave way to mesquite and ocotillo. From behind the relative safety of a large boulder, she watched the scene unfold. 4 riders, dark-clad and moving with a predatory synergy, were closing in on a 5th. The lone rider swayed dangerously in his saddle, his left arm hanging limp, a dark stain spreading across his chambray shirt. His horse, a fine-looking buckskin, was running on pure heart, its sides heaving. The men chasing him were the kind she'd heard whispered about in the town of Contention 30 miles away. They were hard-faced men, with no brand of loyalty save to the guns on their hips. They weren't lawmen. Their movements were too chaotic, too hungry. They were wolves, and they had their prey cornered. The wounded man's horse stumbled. He went down in a cloud of dust and a tangle of limbs. He managed to roll free, but he didn't get up. He pushed himself onto his one good elbow, his pistol still in his hand, ready to make his last stand. The 4 riders circled him slowly, savoring the moment. Martha felt a cold fury rise in her throat. She had watched Frank waste away from a fever that no doctor could name, and no prayer could halt. She had watched him fight helpless against an enemy he couldn't see. These men, this pack of predators, were an enemy she could see. She didn't think. She acted. Scrambling back to the cabin, she grabbed the Winchester. Her hands didn't shake. Her movements were fluid, honed by years of solitude, where every action had to be deliberate. She didn't go back to the boulder. Instead, she climbed the small rocky hillock behind her cabin, the one that gave a clear line of sight to the scene below. Lying flat on the warm rock, she rested the rifle barrel on a natural stone ledge. She wasn't a killer. Frank had taught her to shoot, to hunt, to provide. But he had also told her, sometimes, Martha, the best way to stop a fight is to make them think a bigger one is coming. She didn't aim for any of the men. She aimed for a tall, spindly saguaro cactus about 50 yards to their right. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked against her shoulder, and the report was a deafening crack that was deeper and more authoritative than the pistol shots. A chunk of green flesh exploded from the cactus. The 4 riders jerked in their saddles, their heads snapping in her direction. They couldn't see her hidden as she was among the rocks. She fired again, this time at a patch of ground just in front of their lead horse. Dirt sprayed into the air. The horse whinnied and reared its rider, cursing as he fought for control. Uncertainty had entered the equation. Were they riding into an ambush? Was the wounded man not alone? Their predatory confidence evaporated, replaced by wary calculation. The leader, a big man with a thick black beard, shouted something to his men. They exchanged a few more shots at the fallen rider, more for show than effect, then wheeled their horses around and galloped back the way they had come, vanishing into their own dust. Silence descended once more, broken only by the buzzing of insects and the ragged breathing of the man lying broken on the prairie. Martha stayed put for a long 10 minutes, her eyes scanning the horizon, her heart hammering against her ribs. Only when she was certain they were gone did she slide back down the hillock. She approached the man cautiously, the Winchester held at a low ready. He lay face down, his pistol still clutched in his hand. His blood was a shocking crimson against the pale dirt. She knelt beside him, using the rifle barrel to gently nudge his hand. The pistol fell from his limp fingers. He was young, maybe 20 or 21, with a shock of sandy brown hair, matted with sweat and dirt. A deep, ragged gash ran from his shoulder down his side, likely a bullet that had torn through flesh and muscle. He groaned a low, guttural sound. His eyes fluttered open. They were a startling hazel now clouded with pain. They're gone. He rasped, his voice barely a whisper. They're gone, Martha confirmed. He tried to push himself up, then collapsed with a cry of pain. My thanks to you. He breathed, his eyes rolling back in his head. He was unconscious. Martha stood over him, the reality of her actions crashing down on her. The sun beat down, the air was still, and she was alone, with a bleeding, unconscious stranger. She had driven off one pack of wolves, but she knew the ways of the wild. Trouble, like a scavenger, is often drawn to the scent of blood. By saving this man, she hadn't ended her problems. She had merely invited a new, unknown kind of trouble to her doorstep. And it was coming with the night. Dragging the man back to the cabin was a trial of strength and will. He was heavier than he looked, all wiry muscle and bone, and moving him was a dead weight against her own exhaustion. She half dragged, half carried him, his boots, scuffing a pathetic trail in the dirt, a clear signpost for anyone who might come looking. The smell of his blood, coppery and sharp, filled her nostrils. By the time she got him through the door and onto the braided rag rug in the center of her small cabin, her own dress was stained with it, and her arms ached with a fire she hadn't felt in years. She barred the door and dropped the heavy crossbeam into place, a precaution she usually only took during the worst winter storms. The single room of the cabin, usually her sanctuary, suddenly felt small and crowded thick with the tension of the unknown. The man lay on her floor, a bloody tear in the fabric of her quiet life. For a moment, she just stared at him, breathing heavily. His face in repose was boyish. A smattering of freckles across his nose stood out against the pallor of his skin. He couldn't be much older than the boy she and Frank had dreamed of having. This thought, unwelcome and sharp, spurred her to action. She worked with a practiced efficiency. First water from the basin boiled over the hearth. Then the small wooden chest where she kept her remedies, dried yarrow to staunch, bleeding willow bark for the pain, and a jar of potent foul-smelling salve made from comfrey and pine resin. Frank had called it her witch's brew, but it had healed more than one of their cattle from a nasty scrape. With a sharp knife she used for skinning rabbits, she carefully cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his shirt. The wound was worse than she'd thought. A bullet had gouged a deep furrow along his left side, tearing through the muscle below his shoulder blade. It wasn't a clean hole. It was a ragged, angry mess of tissue and blood. Thankfully, it looked like it had passed through, saving her the grim task of digging for lead. She cleaned the wound as gently as she could, her touch surprisingly steady. The man flinched and moaned in his unconscious state, his body fighting a battle she could only witness. She ground the yarrow into a paste and packed it into the wound, the dark green herbs a stark contrast to the red flesh. Then she wrapped his torso tightly with strips of clean linen torn from her own bedsheets. As she worked, she took stock of him. His hands were calloused, but his fingers were long and slender, not the thick, stubby hands of a field worker. His pistol, now lying on her small wooden table, was a Colt Peacemaker with a custom ivory grip. It was a gunslinger's weapon, expensive and well-maintained. His leather belt was of high quality, the buckle a simple, unadorned silver. Nothing about him suggested he was a simple ranch hand. Her search of his pockets was purely practical. She needed to know who he was. A man like this, hunted by so many, would be looked for. She needed to know if she was harboring a wanted man, a bank robber, a killer. Her fingers found a worn leather wallet. Inside there was no money, just a folded yellowed piece of newspaper. It was a clipping, an advertisement for land in Oregon, dated 2 years ago. Tucked behind it was a small tintype photograph of 4 young men standing shoulder to shoulder. They were all lean and tough-looking, with the same defiant set to their jaws. The man on her floor was the youngest of them, his face in the photo unmarred by pain, a cocky grin playing on his lips. On the back of the tintype, 4 names were faintly inscribed in pencil: Jedediah, Silas, Bow, and Clay. As she was placing the wallet back, he began to stir. His eyelids flickered. He mumbled something, a slurry of words lost to fever. She leaned closer, trying to make it out. "Brothers," he whispered, his voice a dry crackle. "Tell Jed. Kane." Then his eyes opened just for a second and focused on her. They were filled with a delirious haze. "Dalton." He said the name clear as a bell in the quiet room. "Name's Clay. Clay Dalton." The name hit Martha like a physical blow. Dalton. It wasn't a name you heard in polite company. The Dalton brothers were infamous in the territory. Not common thieves, but something else. They were rumored to be fiercely loyal to each other and ruthlessly efficient in their dealings, which were always on the wrong side of the law. They weren't known for wanton cruelty, but they were known for finishing what they started. They had a reputation for getting into scrapes with powerful men, and more often than not, coming out on top. Martha sank back on her heels, the blood draining from her face. She had saved a Dalton. She had fired on men hunting a Dalton. And now a Dalton lay bleeding on her floor, having uttered the name of his brothers. She looked around her small, tidy cabin. The stone hearth Frank had built with his own hands. The rocking chair where she'd sat with him through his final days. The shelves of preserves she'd canned for the coming winter. It was a life built on solitude and order. Now the chaos of the world she had so carefully kept at bay was sleeping under her roof. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple. The shadows grew long, and the familiar shapes of the landscape outside her window began to look sinister. Every gust of wind sounded like a footstep. The hoot of a distant owl sounded like a signal. She had driven off 4 of the man's enemies, but she had just realized the far greater danger. Clay Dalton wasn't alone in the world. He had brothers. And if the Daltons were anything like the stories, they would be coming for him. They would be tracking him with a relentless certainty, and that trail of scuffed dirt and blood led directly to her front door. She wasn't just sheltering a wounded man. She was standing in the path of a storm. Night fell on the territory, not as a gentle blanket, but as a sudden, chilling void. The vast, indifferent canvas of the sky filled with a spray of stars so bright they seemed to mock the darkness below. For Martha, inside the cabin, the darkness was an accomplice to her fear. She lit a single kerosene lamp, keeping the wick low. Its flickering light cast long dancing shadows that turned familiar objects into monstrous shapes. The Winchester was no longer leaning by the hearth. It lay across her lap as she sat in the rocking chair facing the door. Clay Dalton was breathing more steadily now, lost in a fevered sleep. He would occasionally cry out a name, Jed, or a fragmented warning, but mostly he was still. He was the calm at the center of her storm, oblivious to the terror he had brought upon her. Miles away, 3 riders moved through that same darkness, not with fear, but with a grim purpose. They were not the men who had chased Clay. These men moved with less wasted motion, their horses picking their way through the treacherous terrain with an uncanny sureness of foot. They were Jedediah Silas and Bo Dalton. Jedediah, the eldest, rode at the point. He was a man built of rawhide, and resolve his face a mask of grim concentration. Every line on his face seemed carved by hard miles and harder decisions. He was the anchor, the strategist, the one who held the family together with sheer, unyielding will. To his right rode Silas, the hot-tempered one. He was a firecracker in a world of dry tinder, his hand perpetually resting on the butt of his Remington. He saw threats in every shadow and insults in every silence. It was Silas's recklessness that often got them into trouble, and Jed's cunning that got them out. Tonight, his anger was a cold, sharp thing. He was furious at their quarry, furious at their younger brother for getting caught, and furious at the world for being a place where such things happened. Bo rode slightly behind them, the quietest of the 3. He was the watcher, his eyes constantly scanning, missing nothing. Where Jed was the mind, and Silas the fist, Bo was the soul of the Dalton brothers. He possessed a stillness that the others lacked, a quiet competence that was often mistaken for detachment. But beneath his calm exterior was the same fierce, protective loyalty that defined them all. They'd been tracking Clay since dusk, having found the site of the ambush. Jed dismounted and knelt, running his fingers over the churned-up earth. He saw it all, the circle of the attackers' horses, Clay's desperate stand, the spent cartridges from his Colt. Then he saw something else. 2 larger rifle casings a good distance away from an elevated position. Winchester casings. Someone else was here, Jed said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He held up one of the casings for the others to see in the moonlight. A witness or a partner? Silas spat, kicking at a rock. If someone helped Kane, I'll... Quiet, Silas! Jed cut him off. He walked a few paces, his eyes on the ground. The tracks from the attackers lead east away from here. Fast! They were spooked. He then pointed to a different set of marks in the dirt. And this is where our boy went. He was dragged. See heels digging in. Whoever fired that rifle, they took him. Bo knelt beside the tracks. One person, not heavy, small boots. He looked up at Jed. A woman. The suggestion hung in the cold night air. Silas scoffed. A woman drove off Elias Kane's men with a rifle. Not likely. It doesn't matter who it was, Jed said, his jaw tight. They have Clay, and we don't know if they're a friend patching him up or an enemy waiting to sell him. We treat them like an enemy until we know different. They mounted up and followed the trail. It was tragically easy to follow. a clear, straight line to a single point of light flickering in the oppressive darkness. A lone cabin nestled against a rocky outcrop. It looked vulnerable, pathetic, a tiny island of fragile life in a sea of unforgiving wilderness. They tethered their horses in a small arroyo, a few hundred yards out, approaching the final stretch on foot. They moved like ghosts, using the rocks and mesquite for cover their footfalls, making no sound on the hard-packed earth. They spread out, creating a perimeter. Jed took the front, crouching behind an old water trough. Silas melted into the deep shadows at the side of the cabin, near the single window. Bo circled around to the rear, his rifle a dark line against the starry sky. Inside, Martha's senses were stretched to their breaking point. She had heard nothing, seen nothing, but a primal instinct, the one that tells the deer the wolf is near, made the hair on her arms stand up. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, expectant. The night was holding its breath. She tightened her grip on the Winchester, the smooth wood familiar and comforting against her sweaty palms. She stared at the door at the thick wooden crossbeam. It looked so flimsy, so inadequate. Then a floorboard on the porch outside creaked. It was a tiny sound, almost imperceptible, the kind of noise a house makes as it settles in the cool night air. But Martha knew the sounds of her home. Every groan of the wood, every rattle of the window pane was as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. This was not one of them. This was the sound of a man's weight. Her heart leaped into her throat. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She just listened. Another creak closer this time. Then silence. A deep, profound silence that was more terrifying than any sound. They weren't coming for her. They were already here. The wolves were not gathering anymore. They had surrounded her. And the wounded man on her floor was the bait in a trap she had unwittingly set for herself. The voice that came out of the darkness was not a shout. It was a low, controlled rumble, a sound that carried the weight of absolute authority and the clear promise of violence. It seemed to come from the very ground itself. "Mom, inside the cabin, we know you're in there. We know you have our brother." Martha's blood ran cold. The voice was calm, which was somehow more terrifying than if it had been enraged. It was the calm of a man who held all the cards, who was simply stating a fact before proceeding with the inevitable. She instinctively raised the Winchester, its muzzle pointing at the center of the wooden door. "He's hurt bad," the voice continued, belonging to Jedediah. "We're not looking for a fight. We just want him back. Open the door, and no harm will come to you." From the side of the cabin, another voice, sharper and laced with impatience, cut through the night. "Enough talk, Jed. Let's just kick the door in. She could be killing him in there right now. Silas, shut your mouth." The first voice snapped back, a flash of irritation, breaking the calm. "Let me handle this." Martha's mind raced. They were brothers, the Daltons, her worst fears confirmed. Her cabin, her sanctuary, was now a fortress under siege. She could hear the man on the floor. Clay began to stir his moans, growing louder as if sensing the presence of his kin. "He's alive," she called out her own voice, surprising her with its steadiness. She had to control this, had to turn their certainty into doubt. "But he's hurt bad, like you said. Busted up and bleeding. I stopped the bleeding, but he's burning with fever." There was a pause. She had given them information, a sign that she wasn't an immediate enemy. She had confirmed she was helping, not hurting. "What's your name, Mom?" Jed's voice asked, a fraction softer this time. "Martha Sullivan. This is my home." She put a slight emphasis on the word home, trying to convey that she wasn't some accomplice in a hideout. She was a woman defending her property. "Well, Mrs. Sullivan." Jed said, his tone reasonable, but with an underlying steel edge. "We're grateful for you patching up our brother, but our patience is wearing thin. We need to see him. Now." "I can't do that," she replied, her knuckles white on the stock of the rifle. "I saw the men who shot him, 4 of them, riding hard. For all I know, you're with them, come to finish the job." It was a lie, a desperate gambit, but it was all she had. Silas erupted from the side of the house. "With them, with Elias Kane's filth lady, you don't know who you're talking to." The name Kane hung in the air, the same name Clay had uttered in his delirium. It was a piece of the puzzle. Martha seized on it. "I don't know any Kane," she said, her voice rising with a calculated mix of fear and defiance. "I just know I saw the brand on their horses, a black snake coiled around a spade, and I saw the lead rider carrying a Spencer rifle with a brass scope. I don't open my door to anyone until I know who they are." This gave them pause. The details were specific, accurate. It proved she had seen them, that she was an observer, not a participant. She had turned their assumptions on their head. She wasn't just some woman who had stumbled into this. She was a witness, and a sharp-eyed one at that. A new voice, quieter and more thoughtful than the other two, spoke from the back of the cabin. It was Beau. "She's telling the truth, Jed. Only someone who got a good look would have seen Kane's scope." Inside, Clay moaned again, louder this time. "Jed, is that you?" His voice was weak, but clear enough to be heard through the door. This changed everything. The confirmation that Clay was alive and conscious. Jedediah's voice lost all its pretense of patience. "That's it. We're done talking. Ma'am, you have 10 seconds to unbar that door before we take it off its hinges. 1, 2... Panic flared in Martha's chest. The ruse was over. Reason had failed. Violence was coming. She looked around her cabin at the life she had built. She thought of Frank, of his quiet strength. He would not have cowered. "Wait," she yelled, her voice cracking. The counting stopped. Silence. "You want to see your brother?" she said, thinking desperately. "Fine. But we do this my way. You," she directed at the first voice. "The one called Jed. You can come in. You come to the door, you strip off your gun belt and leave it on the porch. You push the door open slowly, and you come inside with your hands empty and in the air. Your brothers stay where they are. One of them makes a move, one of them so much as twitches, and I swear before God, I'll put a bullet in you before you can take 2 steps. Then you can see how your brother is doing." It was an audacious, insane proposal. A lone woman trying to dictate terms to 3 of the most dangerous men in the territory. She could hear them whispering outside. The hot-tempered one, Silas, was arguing furiously. But Jed's voice was the one that cut through. A long, tense silence followed. Martha held her breath, her rifle aimed squarely at the door. Every beat of her heart was a drumbeat in the suffocating quiet. Finally, Jed's voice came again, devoid of any emotion. "All right, Mrs. Sullivan, your terms. I'm coming in." She heard the heavy thump of a gun belt hitting the wooden porch, then the sound of boots on the steps. The latch on the outside of the door rattled. Slowly, cautiously, the door began to creak open. A sliver of moonlight cut across the floor, followed by the silhouette of a tall, broad-shouldered man. His hands were raised to the level of his shoulders empty. His face was in shadow, but his eyes glinting in the lamplight were fixed on her, hard and unreadable. The reckoning was no longer at her door. It had just stepped inside. Jedediah Dalton filled the doorway, his presence sucking the air from the small cabin. He was taller than she'd imagined his frame, lean but powerful. The moonlight behind him cast him in silhouette, a figure of pure menace. As he stepped fully inside, and pushed the door closed behind him, the lamplight caught his face. It was a hard face, weathered and sun-beaten, with intelligent, wary eyes that missed nothing. They flickered from Martha and the unwavering barrel of her Winchester to his brother, lying pale and still on the rug, and then back to her. "Easy now, ma'am," he said, his voice a low murmur. He kept his hands raised, his movements slow and deliberate. "Get on your knees," Martha commanded, her voice tight. Slowly. He gave a slight, humorless smile, but he did as she said, lowering himself to his knees on the wooden floor. He was now at eye level with his brother. He reached out a hand, then stopped looking at her for permission. Martha gave a curt nod. Jed gently placed his hand on Clay's forehead. "He's burning up." Jed stated his voice, now laced with genuine concern. He looked at the clean, tight bandaging around Clay's torso. He saw the bowl of bloodied water, the herbs laid out on the table. He looked back at Martha, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than suspicion crossed his face. It might have been grudging respect. "You did this?" "I did," she said simply. "You're a long way from a doctor." "Sometimes you make do with what you have," she replied, not lowering the rifle. Jed's gaze was intense. "You drove off Cain's men, and you patched up my brother. Most folks would have shut the door and pretended they heard nothing, or put a bullet in him themselves for being a Dalton. Why didn't you?" The question hung in the air, a genuine inquiry into her motives. Martha thought of Frank, of the helplessness she'd felt as he faded away. "I'm tired of watching good men die for no reason," she said, her voice softer. "I couldn't know if he was a good man. But he was a man, and he was dying. That was enough." Jed seemed to accept this. He turned his attention back to Clay, whose eyes were fluttering open. "Jed." Clay breathed, his voice weak. "Martha. She saved me." Jedediah looked from his brother's trusting face to the resolute woman with the rifle. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't a trap. This was something else, entirely. He let his hands drop slowly to his sides. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, changing his tone. It was no longer a threat. It was a negotiation. "You've bought yourself a conversation, but we can't stay out there, and you can't keep us out here. Cain's men, they weren't scared off for good. They were just spooked. When they realize it was just one rifle, they'll be back. And when they come, they won't knock." He was right. Martha knew he was right. Her bluff had worked once, but it was a temporary solution. The Black Snake brand she'd described wasn't just a random detail. She had seen it once before on a wanted poster in contention. The Blackwater Gang, led by Elias Cain. They were known for their brutality, and more importantly, for their persistence. "What do you want?" she asked, the Winchester feeling heavier in her hands. "Let my brothers in," Jed said. "Let us tend to Clay and fortify this cabin. We'll bring our rifles, but we'll lay them on the table. We give you our word, the word of a Dalton, that you will not be harmed. We're not your enemies, Mom. Elias Cain is. He's the enemy of anyone who stands between him and what he wants." "And what does he want?" Martha asked. Jed's eyes darkened. "It's not about money. Not this time. We acquired something of his. A business ledger. It details every bribe he's paid every official he owns from here to the territorial capital. It proves he's behind a string of ambushed army payroll wagons. That book is his death warrant. He thinks Clay has it on him." "Does he?" Jed shook his head. "No, it's safe. But Cain doesn't know that. He'll tear this place apart and kill everyone in it to get it back. He can't afford not to." Suddenly the whole affair snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. This wasn't a simple posse chasing an outlaw. This was a war between two powerful, lawless factions, and her cabin had just become the battlefield. She was caught in the crossfire. Her options were stark: trust these men, these infamous Daltons, or face Kane's entire gang alone. She looked at Jedediah kneeling on her floor. He hadn't tried to trick her. He was being honest, brutally so. She looked at Clay, his breathing shallow, his life effectively in her hands. She had already chosen a side when she fired her first shot from the hillock. She was just now realizing the consequences. Slowly, painfully, she lowered the barrel of the Winchester. "All right," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Bring them in. But their guns go on the table, and one wrong move." "There won't be," Jed promised, getting to his feet. He walked to the door and opened it. "Silas Bow, stand down. We're invited." A moment later, the other two Daltons entered. Silas was a coiled spring of suspicion, his eyes darting around the room, his hand never far from his gun. Bow was calmer, his gaze falling on Clay with a quiet concern, before nodding respectfully to Martha. As promised, they unbuckled their gun belts and laid their formidable collection of pistols and rifles on her small dining table. The metallic clang echoed in the small room, the sound of a truce being struck. The alliance was made. 4 people who were strangers that morning, a lonely widow and 3 notorious outlaws, were now bound together by a common threat. Outside, the vast silent prairie watched and waited, and somewhere in its darkness, Elias Kane and his men were realizing their mistake, their anger growing with every passing minute. The night was far from over. The cabin, once a space of quiet solitude, was now a humming hive of tense activity. It felt crowded, smelling of sweat leather and the faint metallic scent of gunpowder. The Dalton brothers moved with a practiced, almost silent efficiency that spoke of years spent in tight situations. Jedediah was the undisputed commander. He directed his brothers with quiet commands and hand gestures. "Bow, take the window. Keep your eyes on that eastern ridge. Silas, check the back wall. See if there's a way they can get leverage on the door." While Jed fortified their position, Bow approached Martha. He was unlike his brothers. There was a gentleness in his eyes that seemed out of place with their reputation. He gestured toward the water bucket. "Ma'am, permission to get some water for Clay." Martha nodded, watching him. He moved to the small washstand, his movements careful, respectful of her space. "Thank you for what you did," he said, not looking at her. "Clay, he's the youngest. A bit foolish sometimes, but he's got the best heart of any of us." "Why are you all living this life?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. It was too personal, too forward. Bow stopped ladling water and looked at her. His expression wasn't offended, just weary. "Our father was a farmer in Missouri, honest man. Worked himself into an early grave trying to make a living off land that wouldn't give. A banker with a fancy suit and a legal document took it all. Left our mother with nothing. We were just boys. Jed swore we'd never be powerless like that again. Guess we just went too far in the other direction." He gave a sad, lopsided smile. "We stopped being victims. Ended up becoming the thing we hated." He took the water to Clay, who was now propped up against a saddle Jed had brought in. Clay managed a weak smile for his brother. Silas, meanwhile, was a storm of contained energy. He paced the length of the cabin, checking the chinking between the logs, running a hand over the crossbeam on the door. He still looked at Martha with distrust. "You only got this one rifle?" he asked, his tone accusatory. "It's all I've ever needed," she retorted coolly. "Well, it ain't gonna be enough tonight," he grumbled. He glanced at the pile of weapons on the table, then back at Jed, clearly unhappy with their disarmed state within the cabin's walls. Jed ignored him, turning his attention to Martha. "Mrs. Sullivan, you know this land better than we do. Are there any approaches to this cabin we can't see? Gullies, washes?" Martha thought for a moment. "There's a dry creek bed that runs about 200 yards to the north. It's deep enough to hide a man on horseback if he crouches low. It comes up behind that rocky hill I was on." Jed's eyes narrowed. They could flank us, use the hill for cover and get a firing line into the back of the cabin. He cursed under his breath. "We're more exposed than I thought." As the hours crept by, an uneasy rhythm settled in the small space. Martha brewed a pot of strong, bitter coffee on the hearth, and the men drank it in silence. The initial hostility had been replaced by a shared, grim anticipation. They were no longer outlaws and a widow. They were soldiers in a quiet trench, waiting for the battle to begin. Clay had regained more of his senses. The willow bark tea Martha had forced him to drink had taken the edge off the pain. He looked at her, his hazel eyes clear and filled with a profound gratitude. "Ma'am, my brothers and I, we owe you a debt we can't ever repay." "Just stay alive," Martha said, her voice softer than she intended. "That will be payment enough." It was Beau staring out the single window who broke the calm. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, urgent whisper. "Ryder. Far ridge. Just a silhouette against the stars." Instantly, the men were on their feet. Jed grabbed a pair of field glasses from his saddlebag and moved to the window, peering into the darkness. "Just one," Jed confirmed. "A scout. It's Kane's man. I recognize the horse. He's not attacking. He's watching." The air in the cabin grew thick and cold. The waiting was over. They had been found. The eye of the hurricane had passed, and the storm was about to break. "He'll go back and report what he's seen," Jed said, lowering the glasses. His voice was grim. "He'll tell Kane there are 4 horses here now, not 1. He'll tell him the Dalton brothers have dug in. Kane won't be cautious anymore. He knows we're all in the trap together." He turned from the window and looked at his brothers, then at Martha. His face was set like stone. "They'll wait for the dawn," he said. "They'll want the light to shoot by. Get what rest you can. When the sun comes up, so does hell." There was no rest. The hours before dawn were the longest of Martha's life. The men methodically prepared for the assault, their earlier tension replaced by a chillingly calm focus. They used her heavy wooden table and spare furnishings to barricade the door and window, leaving small loopholes to shoot through. Jedediah, having earned a measure of her trust, asked for her Winchester. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said, his voice respectful. "You know the lay of this land. You know where a man might find cover. You'll be more use with this than any of us." He then handed her a pistol from their pile. "But keep this close. They might get through." Martha took her rifle back, its weight feeling different now. It was no longer just a tool for hunting. It was a shield for her home, for the lives of the men who had invaded it, and for her own. As the first faint blush of grey began to lighten the eastern sky, the world outside the cabin came into focus. Jed, peering through a crack in the wall, gave a low whistle. "They're here. At least 8 of them. They're using that creek bed, just like you said." The attack did not begin with a wild charge. It began with a single, perfectly aimed shot. A bullet slammed into the wooden wall just inches from Jed's head, sending splinters flying. It was a message from Elias Kane. "I am here. I see you." Then the world erupted. Gunfire exploded from 3 sides at once. Lead punched through the log walls of the cabin, thudding into the opposite side with deadly force. The air filled with the deafening roar of rifles and the smell of burnt gunpowder. Martha threw herself to the floor, her heart pounding in her ears. "Bow the hill!" Jed yelled over the din. "Silas with me at the front. Clay, stay down, but if you see a clean shot through the window, you take it, Martha. Watch the south flank." The fight became a blur of noise, smoke, and adrenaline. Martha crawled to a small gap between two logs, her designated position. She could see two men moving from rock to rock, trying to get closer. Her hands were shaking, but the moment she settled the rifle stock against her shoulder and looked down the iron sights, a strange calm descended. She remembered Frank's words. "Breathe out and squeeze. Don't pull." She took aim at the second man, leading him just slightly. She breathed out and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester bucked, and 100 yards away the man stumbled and fell, not moving again. She felt a sickening lurch in her stomach, but there was no time for remorse. She worked the lever, chambering a new round. Inside, the Daltons fought like a single four-headed beast. Jed was the cool-headed tactician, calling out targets. Silas was a force of nature, firing his Remington with a terrifying rage, screaming curses at the men outside. Bo, positioned at a small crack in the back wall, fired his rifle with methodical precision, his shots carefully chosen, each one finding its mark. Even Clay, propped against the wall, fired his Colt through the barricaded window, his face pale with pain and determination. The initial assault was repelled. The firing from outside lessened as Kane's men sought better cover. But it was only a lull. "They're regrouping," Jed shouted, reloading his pistol. "They'll try to burn us out next." As if on cue, a flaming arrow arced through the pre-dawn light and thudded into the dry wood of the roof. Another followed. "Silas the roof," Jed commanded. Silas, without hesitation, climbed onto the table, using his knife to pry at the ceiling boards. With a grunt, he pulled one free, exposing the dry tinder of the roof. Smoke was already pouring in. He used a blanket from Martha's bed, beating at the spreading flames. It was then that the front door exploded inwards. A massive figure, the bearded man Martha had first seen, charged through the splintered wood, a shotgun leveled. Before anyone could react, Bo, who had turned from his post, fired his rifle from his hip. The big man was thrown backward out of the doorway, his shotgun discharging into the sky. But the cost was high. As Bo turned, a bullet from outside tore through the new opening, catching him in the thigh. He cried out and collapsed, dragging himself away from the doorway. Chaos reigned. Silas dropped from the ceiling to help his brother. Jed laid down a covering fire through the shattered door. Elias Kane, seeing his chance, made his move. A tall, lean man with cold, dead eyes, he stepped through the doorway, his Spencer rifle raised. He was aiming for Jed, whose back was turned. Martha saw it all in a horrifying instant. She didn't have a clear shot with her rifle. She dropped it, drawing the pistol Jed had given her. She had never fired it before. It felt heavy and alien in her hand. "Kane!" she screamed. He turned, his eyes locking with hers, a snarl of surprise on his face. In that split second of hesitation, she fired. The pistol jumped in her hand, the sound deafening inside the cabin. A red flower blossomed on Kane's chest. He stared at her, his expression of shock turning to one of vacant confusion before he crumpled to the ground. Silence. The sudden ringing silence in the aftermath of the battle was more shocking than the noise had been. The surviving members of the Blackwater gang, their leader dead, lost their nerve. They faded back into the prairie, vanishing as quickly as they had appeared. The sun was now fully risen, its golden light pouring through the smoke-filled, bullet-riddled cabin. It illuminated a scene of utter devastation. The air was thick with the smell of blood and soot. Clay was trying to get to Bo, who was bleeding badly. Silas was pressing a rag to Bo's wound, his face a mask of anguish. And Jedediah Dalton was standing over the body of Elias Kane, looking at Martha. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended words. They left an hour later. They patched up Beau as best they could and loaded him onto his horse. The surviving Dalton brothers stood on her porch, their faces bruised and powder-stained. Her home was nearly destroyed. Jed stepped forward, holding a heavy leather pouch. "Mrs. Sullivan, this won't fix the damage, but it's a start. For what you did. For Clay, for Beau. For all of us." Martha looked at the pouch, then back at his face. She shook her head. "I didn't do it for money, Mr. Dalton." "I know," he said softly. He placed the pouch on the porch rail anyway. "But take it, not as payment, but as a tool. To rebuild. We bring trouble wherever we go. This is us trying to clean up some of what we broke." Clay, leaning heavily on his horse, met her eyes. "Martha," he said, using her first name for the first and last time. "Thank you." She just nodded, unable to speak. She watched as they rode away, 4 figures heading west into the vast, indifferent landscape. They didn't look back. The Dalton brothers were ghosts of the prairie, destined to keep moving, forever haunted and forever hunted. Martha Sullivan stood alone on her porch, the rising sun warming her face. She looked at the destruction around her, at the bodies of the fallen that lay in the dust. Her quiet life was gone, shattered forever. But as she stood there, the Winchester in one hand and a new, unfamiliar strength in her heart, she knew she was not broken. She was a survivor. And in the heart of the wild, unforgiving West, that was the only thing that truly mattered. And so Martha Sullivan's story becomes another whispered legend of the frontier. A testament to the fact that heroism isn't always found in a lawman's badge or a gunslinger's fast draw. Sometimes it's found in the quiet resolve of a lone woman who, when faced with the wolves of the world, decides not to hide, but to fight back with everything she has. Her tale reminds us that the line between right and wrong in the Old West was often blurred, drawn not in ink, but in dust and blood. It raises the question, what would you have done? Would you have barred the door, or would you have picked up the rifle? If this journey back into the forgotten corners of the American West stirred something in you, please show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it, and share this story with someone who appreciates a tale of grit and survival. Most importantly, subscribe to our channel and ring that notification bell. We have so many more stories like Martha's waiting to be told, and you won't want to miss a single one. Thank you for listening.